Okay, continuing with Elena Garro's recollections of things to come. I always want to say memories of the future because that's the literal translation of the title, Recuerdos del Porvenir. I said today we'd look at this time-space issue, that one word, time/space, this kind of odd attempt, an interesting attempt, and successful attempt, I think, to undo the binary between space and time that is characteristic of Western culture, to put space and time into a kind of relationship where you can speak of what I call historical display. That is, you display events and people in a kind of spatial circumstance. I'm going to connect it to muralism, to the Mexican muralist movement, but I want to start by connecting it to indigenous ideas of time and space, which Elena Garro was very knowledgeable about. She clearly studied the pre-Hispanic codices. The singular is Codex, C-O-D-E-X, and the plural is codices, and I'm going to say more about what a codex is or what codices are. And I'm actually going to give you kind of a formal presentation on that with some pictures in a minute. But first, let's look at a few more passages in the novel where we are seeing her play. We've already seen, I think, one of the major examples. We ended with that one last time, I believe, on 255. Just take a look at 255. It's those first three paragraphs that we read together, where we looked at how she does everything she can to overcome language, really, because in Western languages we have concepts that are for time and concepts that are for space, and we think of them separately. She's making dates become like objects moving through space. Remember, we saw that in the very first couple of sentences of this chapter 11. We saw this phrase, which I think is probably my favorite phrase in the novel, the top of 255, about, the beginning, the first line of that page, 255, in his immobile time, that's the dictator Rosas' immobile time, the trees did not change their leaves, the stars were fixed, the verbs to come and to go were the same. Francisco Rosas stopped the amorous current that makes and unmakes words and deeds and kept us in a circular hell. He froze time, it's static. That kind of power, that repressive power keeps things from circulating. And he speaks of a circular hell, she does, the author does, but that doesn't circulate in that sense, isn't positive. It means going nowhere. Because we're going to see that this space-time conception of the indigenous cultures that subtend contemporary Mexican culture have a sense of fluidity, of movement. And you've seen some of that already in Carlos Fuentes' chapter on indigenous cultures and their world views in The Buried Mirror. Keep on going, just a couple more sentences. The Moncadas had wanted to run away from the coming and going of the stars and the tides, the luminous time that spins around the sun. The luminous time that spins around the sun. Time is spatialized there. The space where distances are within the reach of one's hand. They had wanted to escape from the single bloody day of Ixtepec, but Rosas abolished the door that leads us to the memory of space, and rancorously he blamed them for the motionless shadows he had heaped upon them. All very beautiful. If you had to chart that, it would be hard to do. You think, oh, well, she's kind of being poetic here. What she's trying to do is subvert our certainties about how time is measured and how space is measured, and saying, look, they're the same. Now, go to a couple more places where you see this timelessness going on, or space-time idea. And she's taking language and trying to give us a sense of another worldview, just as Vargas Llosa did in The Storyteller, taking a Western medium, which is the novel, which depends on plot. What's plot but one thing happening after another, right? Depends on space, setting, being separate from time, and so forth. So she's taking a Western form and subverting it, I think. That's my argument. Look at 138. We'll see what she's up to here. I have a whole list of page numbers where you see this we or I narrator busily subverting space and time as separate. entities, 138. Both time and motion stop here. It's like a still shot in a stop time shot in a movie. Look at just a few sentences. You will have noticed this. This is the magical moment of Julia's disappearance. This is what ends the chapter, but look at the top paragraph on 138 for a minute. The young man slid back the bolts, released the latches, opened the door, and went out. Don Joaquin was about to follow, but at that precise moment, something that had never happened before occurred. Time stopped dead. I don't know whether it stopped or slipped away and was replaced by sleep. A sleep that had never overtaken me before. There was also total silence. Not even the throbbing of my people's pulse could be heard. I really do not know what happened. I was outside of time, suspended in a place without wind, without murmurs, without the sound of leaves or sighing. I came to a place where crickets stand still in the attitude of chirping and without ever having chirped, where dust does not settle and roses are petrified in the air beneath the motionless sky. She's preparing us for that. They lived happily ever after, which is also time shall cease. Sense that final, because the lovers will soon disappear and live happily, we assume, forever. Look at the very last sentence there. We can say, well, yeah, this is magical realism. Time doesn't stop. But there's something systematic about this. So let's look at some other examples. But look at the final paragraph of that same final sentence of that same long paragraph. I don't know how long we were lost in that motionless space. Now, she's been going on about time stopping, but somehow space has to come into it. So both time and space are motionless. Everything hangs suspended. Well, you could say even in a realistic novel, you know, her heart stopped, her heart was in her throat, her heart stopped for beating for a moment or something. But this is described in such a lyrical way that you can see that the author's getting to something. Okay, next example out of many, 201, page 201. This is the same page that the ants appear on that Lisa told us about last time. I hadn't noticed the ants. What I was interested in is what goes on in terms of time and the materializing of time, the spatializing, if you want, of time. It's the paragraph that begins below the middle of the page. He remembered where he was. This is Martin Moncada. And he remembered Juan and Nicolas. A rain of centuries fell on the party in Ixtepec. And had he unleashed the landslide of the centuries on the bodies of his children, he was one of the enthusiasts of that madness. I'm not going to go on reading. Just look at that rain of centuries. One more time when she's trying to make time into something material, something spatial, something that occupies space and impels space. It's not just that time, like a calendar, sits there on the table. It's that they get mixed up. Okay, next example. Stop me if we're going too fast. I think you will have noticed these, and maybe you'll have your own examples you'll want to add to them. Page 242, 43. She often does this at the beginning of chapters. She'll be very lyrical and poetic, and then she'll get, as we saw in last time, about midway into the second page of the chapter, she will start retrospective narration where things start to happen in a more realistic fashion. Look at the paragraph at the bottom of the page 242. Thus we return to the dark days. The game of death was played painstakingly. The townspeople and the military did nothing but plot deaths and intrigues. I watched them come and go sadly. If only I could have taken them on a stroll through my memory so that they could see the generations now dead. Nothing was left of their tears and sorrows. Absorbed in themselves, they did not realize that one lifetime is not long enough to discover the infinite flavors of the mint, the lights of the night, or the multitude of colors that colors are made of. One generation, and then we get this lyrical thinking about time. One generation follows another, and each repeats the acts of the one before it. Only an instant before dying, they discover that it was possible to dream and to create their own world, and so forth. I'm going to let you go ahead. this is to introduce another mythical woman at the bottom of the page. Look at, and this is going to be Isabel, right? Isabel's status now has changed in the town. She's taken on Rosas, or vice versa. So there's a kind of lyrical thing here, but finish, if you will, when you're looking to review this book, finish that paragraph about the generations following each other. It's not quite the same materialization of time that we've talked about so far, but it's another way of saying that we inhabit time in ways that are more complicated than we might realize. Now, look, one more example, 255, and then I want to talk to you, well, we've been to 255, so let's, we started there, so we don't need to go there again. Are there examples that you all want to point out where you've noticed this kind of thing? It goes on, and I can give you my list of page numbers as I was reading and making notes, but if you think about a Diego Rivera mural, and I'm going to show you some in a minute, or you think about a mural that is a historical mural, there's something that's similar, this historical display idea. Up here, one thing's happening. Over there, something else is happening. And it may even be a progression over many centuries, as it is in Diego Rivera's murals, to show Mexican history in one space, to spatialize temporal events. And we can say, well, murals are pretty usual. You know, and historical murals aren't that unusual. So, but if you think of a novel as trying to achieve that same effect, it's not so usual. So I think here, if we get this down with Garro, we'll have quite a lot down. Yeah, Lisa?
Just the continuously repeating Felix is taking the pendulum off the clock to stop the clock.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, yes. Yeah, clearly you could say, yes, yeah, thank you very much, of course, and setting the clock, and there's this whole winding, and there's this whole thing about clocks going on here too. Thank you, that's absolutely to the point. They're almost too explicit in a sense about what she's trying to do. But any novel that starts with a narration of the dead town's past, that you already know that this is something about time. It's not like the narrator or the narrative voice is in the present. Yeah.
One of the art works that I was kind of thinking of too was a lot of Dali's works, because he used ants and clocks, and even his most famous with the melted clocks, The Persistence of Memory. I just kept bringing up some images of him as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting comparison. There is a web paper on Dali in one of the years on your website, and someone else was making a bit that same connection, though not with this novel. Thank you. Yeah, Salvador Dali's Melting Clocks, which is probably, along with his Crucifixion, the most important of his paintings. Something about trying to say something about time that can't quite be said. So you say, well, what does he mean? Time is melting. Time doesn't melt because time's immaterial. And he says, well, I'm materializing it with these clocks. Thank you. That's very interesting, Stephanie. I hadn't really connected that at all. That's a nice point. Other comments to be made here about all of this? I think once you start to see this, you'll see it everywhere in the novel, and you probably have already seen it. But what I've done in an essay I've written on this novel, which I was just recommending to Melissa in my volume called Magical Realism, I have an essay that deals with a number of things, but one thing it does is these three novels I was telling you about last time that are what I call animate earth novels, novels narrated somehow about a dead town, and the town is already underground, so you hear the voices underground. Pedro Páramo, this one, and The House of Breath by William Goyen. They make a nice trio to talk about how these three authors are saying something about the nature. Not just time passes and we all die. It's something more than that, I think. And I relate them to the Mesoamerican codices. And I brought you some show and tell here, and I'm going to show you pictures. But I have this book. I'm going to show you images from this book, the Borgia, it's called, B-O-R-G-I-A, Codex. It's a bunch of fragments of painted books from the Altiplano, Puebla, Mexico City. what is now Mexico City. And you'll see the reason I know anything about this is because anthropologists have tried very hard to figure these things out for us. You'll see on one page is the way the fragment actually looks, and I bet you can find a lot of this on the web, but on this side, someone has taken the outlines of the images, Edward Seler, S-E-L-E-R, 1904, and explained who the gods are and what is going on this page. I'm going to talk to you more specifically, but if anybody wants to take a look, I brought this, and then I want to tell you a little bit about the format, and I don't have the right slide of the format of the codices. Understand, you'll remember we read in Galeano a segment called Mani, M-A-N-I, and it was Diego de Landa, and remember how he's throwing the scrolls on the fire, but he says, I use it as a kind of one of those little books within the book. Galeano says, but the voices and the memories of people won't die even though their scrolls are consumed. Diego de Landa was busily burning the codices of the Maya in Yucatan. This is a facsimile of one of the very few remaining ones, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what they are, but they're like this. They are, I'm going to show you the right side because you can't really see it. Well, both of them have writing on it, but this side. They're accordion folded books. A book is kind of the European word. They are made either of bark paper or of animal skin and glued together. So people, anthropologists, instead of referring to pages, refer to folds. These are also called screen folds. So here, this happens to be the Codex Cospi, C-O-S-P-I. And these kinds of books are for sale in Mexico for people who are interested. This one has an accompanying book that explains it all, because I can no more read it than I can fly. Of course, I don't have that language, but once you start studying, well, this god figure here means possibly this and that, there are some ways of understanding. And I'm going to show you also this. There are only 3 Maya codices left that are pre-conquest. I'm going to talk to you about post-conquest too, but this is the Dresden. They're called the Paris, the Dresden, and the Madrid. Now, what names are these that are in Maya? Come on. No, most of the codices that remain were taken to Europe as curiosities by people who were curious about different stuff. There was plenty of looting and pillaging. Unfortunately, way more were burned by priests in the New World. And this is Mesoamerica. It's the Mayas and the Nahuas. The Andean groups didn't do this kind of pictographic writing. They had other forms of counting mainly. But here is the Dresden. I'm going to show you just one slide of it. You get the idea. It's similar, but a little different visual language, if you want. So these are like our printed books. They were performed by priests who also wrote them, and they're kind of like divine dictation, kind of like revealed truth, as as Christians consider the Bible to be, as Muslims consider the Quran to be, and so forth. But they were performed, and it wasn't as if everybody sat around listening. It's not like the storyteller. There was the priests were the scribes. They were also trying to figure out the stars and so forth. And these books then recorded the wisdom, the collective wisdom of the ages. And so it's a horrible thing that we don't have more than we do. I'm going to mention some. The Borgia, that's Borgia, as in the rich Italian historical family. Many of the existing, now there are more than 3 Nahua codices, and they often have the names. One's called the Vatican, and one's called, one is in the, they have the names of the collectors, the people who saved them or who bought them from those people who brought them as curiosities, and so forth. So it's a kind of subcategory, but if we talk about Latin American literature, we really should start with the codices, because after all, and with the glyphs, because we're going to see some glyphs too. So and all of these are express the space-time that we're trying to talk about. So I'm going to read you some things as I show you slides. So why don't we, Scott, shift to my pictures here, and I'll show you about 25 pictures or so. As I said, these Mesoamerican codices are not books in any contemporary sense. And they're not really codices either, because a codex, if you look it up in the dictionary, refers to a bound manuscript. It's not yet a book, but it's a manuscript, handwritten but bound. So these were neither manuscripts in the usual European sense of the word, that is handwritten, nor were they bound. But the term codex, or the codices, the plural, which was first used in the 19th century by historians to refer to Mesoamerican texts painted according to native canons. What I mean is painted according to a visual language that was known. It's like our alphabet, if you want. So this word codex has stuck, and I'll use it, even though when the Spaniards first came, they called these things libros pintados, painted books. And I sort of like the idea of a painted book. In fact, there's a very famous passage in Bernal Díaz del Castillo, whom you'll know if you know the history of the conquest, the true history of the conquest of New Spain, written by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who was the lieutenant of Cortes, or at least the soldier that was accompanying him 50 years after the conquest, but he tells it all very as if it were yesterday. How many of you know that book, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain? Yeah, that it's really a very important book if you're interested in the conquest. And what Bernal Díaz del Castillo said was, we found these books, these painted books everywhere as we went from town to town all our way up to Tenochtitlan. And he says they were like folded cloth from Castile, from Spain. And I love that. He says it admiringly because they seemed like cloth, this bark paper, or this vellum, the deer skin. So they're not books, they're not codices, but they are, let's say, ideographic and pictographic reconstructions of, or constructions of, a worldview that we're interested here. Then this different pieces are glued together, and so we have a typical, let's say, structure or form for these painted books. Okay, you've seen the cospi that I just held up in the accordion folding, so you've gotten the general idea. And here you have one page from the Borgia that we're going to look at here on the PowerPoint. You were just looking at it a minute ago. Now, if you wanted to know what all of those things were, all of these figures represent, what you do is you'd start by looking, let me do this. You start by noticing this. This is a kind of symbolic counting. The little dots mean 1, the bars mean 5. This is known. These are ideographs. They're symbols. That's what ideograph means. It's a graphic representation of an idea. And then these you would call pictographs because they aren't, of course, realistic in any sense that we moderns would say, but they are meant to represent different gods. What's going on here is, notice, in all 4 quadrants, if I can get this to go, somebody is hitting something with a dart, as it's called, a saeta. And that's one of the places where that piercing arrow of time. These are the Venus tables. The Mesoamericans were very concerned with the planet Venus, and they were trying to figure out what the Venus would do next. There's always a great deal of fear here because nature is so powerful that we have to figure this out. We have to propitiate the gods. We have to try to anticipate their moods, their dispositions. Here again you see it. And each time there's blood going on here. So they're different figures holding but similar looking, and each one of these you can find out what god it represents by reading Edward Soleil. In other words, one goes to the experts for this because there's no way we can intuit this, no way we can guess. Here's another example of another, this is called the Borbonico, as in Bourbon, the royal family that follows the Habsburgs were the Bourbons, French reigning house. This a different style, as you can see, but it's also from the highlands, the central Mexican highlands. Here, I mean, one starts to be able to read a bit. This is water, and there's something going on here. These are our numerical symbols again, and look at their two faces to this god. Again, if I needed to know exactly what's going on here, I would consult a book that goes through fold by fold by fold and figure by figure by figure in order to know what they're about. This Codex style, as I call it, and other people call it too, is also found on ceramics. This is a vase from southern Campeche, so it's a Maya vase. And also on reliefs. In these books and the hieroglyphic languages of this being a Maya piece were also carved in stone. So it's not just the painted books, it's also other artifacts where this language, this visual language is deployed.
This is a building?
That is a stele from, let's see, I can tell you exactly, from Palenque, which is an important site in Chiapas, the state of Chiapas, southern Mexico. Lots and lots of these carved stele. If you really want to look at this particular Maya language, go to a beautiful book called The Blood of Kings. It's an exhibition catalog that tells you all about this, written, well, one of the authors and one of the curators of this exhibition is the late Linda Sheely, Shiele, who was a professor at University of Texas at Austin. She died way too early. And then here's the Dresden that I also flung about in front of you, 2 pages. See, it's similar, and yet you can easily see a Maya, the difference between the Maya and the Nahua codices. Now, I'm going to talk to you about this. This is where we get into the time-space business more. There are lots of pages like this in the Borgia and others. In fact, I'll show you. These are similar. They're called tonal amatl. You don't need to know that word. But what it means is, tonal is the word for day, and amatl is the tree. Amate is what bark paper is called. And Edward Saleh, the fellow who did the Borgia Codex that I was, explained it all to us, he translates tonal amatl in this way: the book of days and their influence on destinies. Doesn't that start to sound like Elena Garro? The book of days and their influence on destinies. It's not a calendar and it's not a map, it's both. I'm going to read you a bit here. Far from our own calendar, with its linear numeration of years and its 7 repeating day names and 12 month names that represent only themselves, the significance of their Roman reference, August or July, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, all of those we've forgotten completely where the names of our months and our days come from the Roman reference, really. But here, a given day, and you're going to see a bit more, a given day has a personality. It has a complex material and mythic identity. You read the tonal amatl from the bottom to the top and from right to left. Each day is given a number, a direction, a hieroglyphic symbol representing an object or animal. You see those along the edge here. And a presiding deity up here. I mean, I can't do it for you perfectly. I should be able to see, you see, this is the analog to a certain day. I can't quite do that. But for example, when we say that the Aztecs came to the Valley of Mexico in 1325, I believe is the date, and settled in Tenochtitlan, how do we know that? Because people can read the calendrical information and know the dates, translate the dates into the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use. So this grid of the tonal amatl projects metaphorically the movement of the gods in space of human experience, if that makes sense. Movement of the gods in our space, how we experience the world, how we're part of the world, how the gods determine things, that book of days and their destinies. And then the same, this is the tonal amatl of the Madrid Codex, which is one of the Mayas. So you'll see again this way of charting space, charting time in space. I'm going to show you some more examples from the Borgia. part of the interesting thing about spatial and temporal collapsing, if you want, or integration of both, is that the directions had a personality: north, south, east, west, and the direction of the center. This happens to be the page, I know it because Edward Soleil tells me so, I can't read the language, but he says this is the page that represents south. Here, up here, you have the god of death. You can see his skull. Here you have Huitzilopochtli, god of fire, and he knows that this would represent Huitzilopochtli. Down here, I'm not sure what's going on, but a lot, and it would all have been significant, and it would have been performed. It's not like it was read, and you could say, well, reading is a performance, but it was really more than that. It was a sense of the interpretation as the priest had the representation in front of him. Anthropologists know things. This is east. We have the god of flowers, Xochipilli, up here. We know the symbology because we've read people who've studied it. And Quetzalcoatl, god of wind and other things. North, again, you see the same deployment of space. But you see what I mean? If this is about directions, there's so much going on that it seems not to be, this is, as I say, north, but north, we don't think in Western terms at all of north having a personality. That the space is active and fluid and moving. Up here, god of corn, and here, Mictantecutli, I believe is how you say it, the god of death again, and you see the skull. Yeah, Lisa, push your button.
I have a question. So the Tonal Amatl is something, is it meant to be a historical record or more like an almanac?
It's more like an almanac. I'm going to go ahead and try to give you an idea, but what I end up saying, and I'll say it right now, is if we can wrap our little Western minds around the idea of a combination of calendar and map and dance, then we have something like what the Tonal Amatl is. It's if you imagine watching a dance, but then thinking of that dance as having to do with the world directions, with the movement of the stars. I mean, remember, these people were great astronomers. They really did have the heavens down. And you can sort of, that maybe is, we should add to our metaphor, if we can think about, you know, the movement of the night sky as well as dance and calendars and maps, then we have this sense of a world that's in movement, and that space and time aren't separate. So it's an almanac. You see, it's very hard for us to find an analog. An almanac, sort of like the old farmer's almanac, you look and see whether it's going to be if it's predicted to be a cold winter, for example. These are divinatory, as they're called. It's prediction. They're divining. They're guessing what the gods are doing, but it's not a historical record. The Mayas did keep track of the kings, the succession of kings. So and even in their codices, there will be, and certainly carved on stone, there are records of certain dynasties. So there is that sense of time past and progressing in that historical record. But no, it's more like astrology. Think of reading your sign in the Aries today. You will watch out, don't make any business deals or something. It's more like astrology in a sense, rather than an almanac. I'm going to keep on trying here, because that's kind of the fun of trying. It's like the storyteller again. You put yourself, if you can, in a mindset that isn't yours. And remember how I read that statement basically suggesting it's impossible, that what we know has to fit into some structure that's already known. We're a teeny baby, at which point we could become any cultural model that our parents happen to be in. Oh my. Well, the gods are speaking. Okay, so Let me just show you one more image, and this is up the upper right-hand corner is my interest. This is the direction of the center, which is up and down. So you see the little fellow spinning there, and he's, you could say that he's spinning, and it's clear that he's spinning. It shows the movement there. What the jaws of the earth actually are what frame him. So we get this sense of up and down. And here, I think this is a great example of what we're trying to talk about, which is that space is in the person, that we inhabit space, and it's not like it's just out in front of us and we're looking at it. It's a different sense. I had it written down better than that, but I'll conclude what I was saying, and I just said it. By conflating our sense of maps, calendars, and the regulated, structured movement of dance, we may approach an understanding of the scriptural medium that precedes the modern divorce of time from space, which is to say the modern divorce of cosmology from history, and ultimately perhaps of nature from culture. I'm just going to keep on talking. Sorry about the noise. We'll just see what we can do with it. Okay, let me show you then what we go to is post-conquest codices. The indigenous peoples didn't stop painting on bark paper and vellum the instant the Spaniards arrived. But you can see already a hugely westernized perspective. This is something so different from that. And what's going on here? This now is being used as a record of tribute. You see the feathers, you see the skins, you see the pieces of jade in the line up at the top of the page. Now there's a new consumer base for codices, and it's the invading Spaniards. And so they say, well, let's keep record of this. This is partly, of course, to protect the indigenous peoples too. But suddenly their old world, the world view has been destroyed in ways that are, Scott, should I carry on here? Is this totally a mess? Yeah, but it's like this can be recorded nonetheless, right? Not really. I'll keep on talking anyway. That's all right. We don't care. I just want to show you these slides since I've brought them in. And look at what else is added here, alphabetic script. Now there's a cataloging and a labeling, which starts to feel very much like us. That is like Western illustrations with captions and so forth. And I'll show you this. This is a very special post-conquest text. It's called the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, and it's a contact modification of the codices. This is something that was painted after the conquest, and it's a record, a historical record. I'm going to show you another picture. This is La Malinche in the middle, and it says Tlatelolco, which is a part of now in the center of Mexico City, where there would be a confab. The Tlaxcaltecos, it's the city near Puebla, were allies to Cortés. So they're recording and hoping to get their due from helping the Spaniards. And one more, here, this is Cholula outside of Puebla. And again, we see battle. We see here's La Malinche is translating. And we see what's going on. The indigenous peoples are doing very poorly under the hooves of this Spanish horse. The battle going on a pyramid. Here, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. So this is one of the most, the original's been lost, but there was a copy made. This is one of the most astounding because it's painted from the point of view of the people we would ordinarily assume to be those who lost. But in fact, Tlaxcaltecos. So paint one more example of a post-conquest codex. Now you see some of the ancient or the pre-contact ideographs and pictographs are retained. This looks somewhat like what we were seeing in the pre-contact codex, but now we have, of course, the alphabetic script beneath the pictures. And here, this is called the, hang on. It's called the Taller de Llano Ramensis, 2 Italian names, and it is a European, now we can say book correctly because it's bound. It now is a European style book. So these individual folded strips of, or let's say strips of bark paper are, no, I'm sorry, it's no longer bark paper either. This one is actually painted on imported paper from Europe. So as with everything, the 2 cultures begin to blend. This is, one of you has done your web paper on Bernardino de Sahagún, who did the famous Florentine Codex that we've talked about and we read about in Galeano. Here is one page from that. This is again according to Western ideas of representation. Even though it's flat, it's not 3-dimensional, there's no vanishing point. But this is a picture of so many of a wedding, an Aztec wedding. Look at here, literally tying the knot, which is kind of interesting. Those aprons called tilma, T-I-L-M-A. We know it because of Juan Diego and the image of the Virgin that was imprinted on his tilma. Here we see. And you'll remember that Sahagún was interested in learning about indigenous culture before the contact, before the conquest. And so he used this kind of representation because he knew that his informants, Aztecs, were used to pictographic and ideographic language. There are also, as you can see, labels. Now, I just want to go to Diego Rivera fairly quickly, and then I won't natter on too much longer. But I think Diego Rivera, just like Elena Garro and like so many writers of the Mexico of the 20th century, were very aware of their indigenous heritage. And after the revolution, 1910 to 1917, the Mexican Revolution, though that's, as we know, is too simple because we're reading a novel about the aftermath of that in the 20s. But Diego Rivera came back from 14 years in Europe in 19 sat out the whole Mexican Revolution. He became its great codifier, of course. But he comes back and he starts to celebrate indigenous culture. What's going on here? This is in the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City, right on the main square, the main Zócalo. And what do we have? We have a tlacuilo, one of the priests who would be the performers of the things we've seen. And what is this? I'm going to show you a detail. It's a codex. Look at. It's got the same tonal amatl. You can see there what we were seeing earlier. Look at the tattooing. These are about 8 or 10 panels, huge, in the Palacio Nacional, celebrating various indigenous cultures in Mexico. And what he's really celebrating, beyond the fact that they're indigenous cultures, is their great artistry. They were great artists. So what's going on here? This is the Tarascan culture in Michoacan. They're dyeing fabrics. Look at, you see the dyeing procedures here. These people are painting what are called relaciones cartográficas, the maps, certain kinds of maps. But here, this figure obviously is the central figure. And Diego Rivera very much related to being a tlacuilo himself. He says, you know, I'm the modern day priest scribe writing down the cosmogonic essence of Mexican culture. So he identifies, here's another one of the panels. And again, you see the feather work, the costumes. Look at the feathers. Here, more feather work. This is, let's see, I'm going to tell you which culture this is. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. This is the Mixtec civilization. And notice underneath, too, you have this grisaille, as it's called, the gray. It's not fresco. This is, of course, fresco. Fresco is wet cement, right, that gets painted on, and the cement, or the cement, maybe not quite the right word, plaster, absorbs the paint. Below, all the way around, and this is an inner courtyard of a huge building, you see the little frieze, if you want, along the bottom that echoes some of the themes. Here, Okay, well, I think you get the idea. You're seeing it. Now, I'm interested in this because these two things here, this is, obviously they're planting corn. Here you see it's not comal, help, it's called, can't think of the word, grinding the corn. ¿Cómo? Yeah. It's not, it's what? Molcajete is round, but it's similar. Isn't it? Is it a molcajete? I think it's round, and that has a pestle. And it could be something like you just said, but sorry, I'll look. We'll get that. Anyway, it's the production of corn. Anybody got a better idea? What do you think was it?
Was it petate or metate?
Well, maybe it's metate, because petate is a straw mat. Then it's metate. Okay, thank you. But why would you call it mano y metate?
The mano is the thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. So it's like saying mortar and pestle. Okay, thank you. Metate is what I've heard. These are, I'm going to show you little details. They come from one of the codices. He's showing, this is the Aztec civilization, and he has pictographs here from, you see them here, it's the same pictograph. It's a little person here on a table. One is the ideograph for the corn god, and one representing abundance. Let's go back and see. The corn god and this representing abundance. It's different. There's no person on the table there, but historians who are interested in Diego Rivera's indigenous sources have pointed out this borrowing. Where would he have seen these codices that are in European libraries? He spent 14 years in Europe. Somehow he was quite aware of the production of the codices. Here in a little side detail, this is an actual pilaster. It's not part of the painting, but he's painted around the pilaster. And what do we have? The production of bark paper. Here is an amate tree, and it's being stripped, which is how it's done. And you take the strips and you boil them in ash and something else, ash and something, in order to get it soft. And then what do? You take it, and it's like a weaving. I know because I have visited. There are two places that still produce bark paper in Mexico, and I've seen it done, in this case with my own eyes. They put it on a loom with a warp and a woof, and then pound it, and that's what this woman is doing with her mallet here, pounding the wet strips till they dry and make up a single piece of bark paper. Sometimes when you hold a piece of bark paper up to the light, you can see that there are spots that weren't altogether covered, and that sometimes actually people will repair them with orchids, which has a kind of glue that covers the holes of the sheet of amate. You can buy sheets of amate in any market in Mexico. It's still produced. Usually it'll be painted with bright colored birds, or sometimes with little village scenes. There's still a market, but of course now it's a market for artisania, for craft, rather than for the mythic purposes. Here's a detail of the image I just showed you. Here you see her with her frame pounding this one little town that makes amate. Still, when you approach the town, you hear pound, 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 and you wonder what that sound is, and then you realize that everyone's there making amate, and what they're pounding with now is the bottoms of Coke bottles, which is quite interesting. Below here in the gray part beneath, you'll see there's a Codex, and what does it recount? Look, it's recounting the conquest. This is Diego Rivera's own, if you want, Codex, and we have the armed people and we have the indigenous peoples, and it's not good news. I wanted to show you one more of Diego Rivera's murals. This is not a particularly famous mural of his. It's a double mural in the museum of, in the Hospital of Cardiology at the university building for the study of cardiology. And what I want to suggest is that his murals, even though they weren't dealing with codices, and these certainly aren't, they're dealing with the history of the discipline, if you want, the old doctors going up to be, here the new ones. Here's someone who was burned for his beliefs. I'm going to tell you, hang on, exactly what these are. Oh, I don't have exactly. One is the history of biology, and the other is a history of the implements that are necessary for the scientific study. But look at the structure. It's a structure that goes from the oldest up to the newest. There's an attempt to have the history as a kind of circulating space. It's not the kind, there's something he's learned, as I think Elena Garro has learned, from the codices about displaying history as a spatial matter. It's not as if these fellows are in little lines. There's a movement upward, a movement that goes through space in a particular way that we've already intuited a little bit with the codices. And then I'll just show you a couple. It's very typical if you know Mexico, and in fact Colombia and other places that I know well, that the interior patios of buildings will have murals all over them. There will have a spatial display of their history. This is the town of Tlaxcala, about 2 hours from Mexico City, right near a half an hour from Puebla, the Altiplano. The Tlaxcaltecos, as I said, were the ones, that lienzo, the canvas of Tlaxcala, they were the allies of Cortés against the Aztecs, who were their oppressors. And what do we have? We have the same kind of spatial movement. It's historical. I'm going to show you a couple of close-ups. There's all of this writing down at the bottom, and look what's happening here. An indigenous person is consulting a codex. It's not exactly the same form as we see, but down here what you have is a narrative of Diego Duran, who was a cronista, a Spaniard, who came and chronicled the history of the indigenous groups in this area. So this is very much about the indigenous history, not the recent history of Tlaxcala. And we know, of course, who the muralist is. He's a guy who has a very indigenous name, Desiderio Hernandez, but then Xochitliotzin is his last name. And what is he doing here? He's doing his own portrait. We're going to assume that this, and I know it's the case because it's said, that here he is. But what is he doing? He's looking back to his elders. The tradition of the Tlacuilo, Tlacuilo, I should have spelled that before, the poet, priest, painter, performer, all those P words. He's showing that he's part of this trajectory, let's say, that he's carrying on the tradition of the Tlacuilo in his own painting. This is in a kind of stairwell in the same interior patio of Tlaxcala, which you saw, right, Lisa? Yeah. Here, what is this? It's that thing we just looked at in Diego Rivera's mural, the ideograph, well, pictograph, let's say, the pictograph of the corn god. And here I think what Xochitliotzin is doing is paying homage not only to the forefathers who made their codices, but also to Diego Rivera, who's the man who made muralism a Mexican monument, let's say. I mean, there were other great muralists too, and we can say that there were murals even in indigenous sites, but somehow this particular ideograph seems to recall Diego Rivera's mural in the Palacio Nacional that we just saw. And then what I want to say is that it's like the codices aren't dead, and of course I'm making that argument with Elena Garro, but this happens to be along the Periférico, the Beltway in Mexico City, and it's a wall. This painting is gone. I'm so glad I took pictures when I did. But look at what's going on here. This is like, these are images from codices that someone bothered to go and paint on a public wall. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was an art project. Maybe it was just a desire to do so. Look at the fellow here. These come from particular codices, but I can't tell you who this is, though I should be able to maybe, but I can't. And then just various kinds of let's say, modern glosses on the codices. I love the colors as it happens. After a while, it started to wear off, and then pretty soon there was a big political sign painted on it. and then after a while more, these were actually taken probably about 15 years ago, and then after a while more, there was another different sort of Codex style painting. So people, it's a way of connecting back, let's say, to a different sense of time and space than think that's it. Yep. So anyway, I don't know if this is very resonant for Garro, but I hope that it will be, because Elena Garro clearly knew about the codices, as did her then husband, Octavio Paz, as we were just talking about. And of course, we've read Octavio Paz at the beginning of the course. But there's an interview with her where, when I first read this novel, I said, of course, she's playing with these structures. I mean, it just seemed sure to me. But then, luckily, I came upon a, let's see if I can find it. There is a book by a woman named Anita Stoll, S-T-O-L-L, on Elena Garro. If any of you are writing on her, you'll be interested in her book. It's in the library. And Stoll actually talks about Garro as a mestizo mode of writing, that she wants to bring the indigenous history and cosmology into it. But I don't think I have the quote, but I have a quote from her. Let me read it. She says, Stoll says about the novel, that there's an inclusion of beliefs, perceptions, and occurrences that in European culture would be considered impossible, a coming together of disparate elements from the different cultures, configuring a new historical reality that subverts conventional patterns of Western rationality. I'm sorry, I don't think I have the quote where she herself says, I wanted to do something that would replicate the sense of space and time in the codices. So it's not exactly a mystery. I mean, it's not, you know, literary critics, we all have to find reasons for what we do. We have to say, well, you know, the codices are nice and Elena Garro's nice, but am I going to be able to connect the two in a meaningful way? And it's always a very happy moment when we find that the author says, oh yeah, I was influenced by that. So anyway, I have the feeling that's my phone. I think I'm going to quit for today, and I'll see you on Tuesday. We're going to talk about papers. I'd like to hear your paper topics and find out what you're thinking. Some of you have already talked to me. I've seen one paper, but we'll carry on next time. Yeah, Eli?